When a sheltered prince stepped beyond palace walls, he discovered what his father had hidden: age, sickness, death. But where others saw only suffering's shadow, Siddhartha Gautama sought its source. Through extremes of luxury and deprivation, he found a middle path that transformed human understanding. Beneath a fig tree in Uruvela, his quiet awakening changed civilization more profoundly than any battle. Neither God nor prophet, Buddha taught only what he witnessed: that all things arise and pass, that suffering springs from attachment, and that freedom lies not in escaping existence but in seeing it clearly. His revolution was stillness itself, the courage to face impermanence without fear. A man sits cross-legged beside a dying fire. Around him, the forest hums with night insects, and in the distance, a temple drum beats for the morning sacrifice. He has abandoned his family, his name, and even food, yet the question that drove him from home still burns unanswered. He is not alone. Across the plains of India, thousands of seekers are doing the same, turning their backs on comfort to confront the mystery of suffering. The world was ready for Siddhartha, though no one yet knew his name. It was the 6th century BC, and the human spirit itself seemed to be breaking its old boundaries. From the Himalayan foothills to the delta of the Ganges, kingdoms rose and vanished like waves in the monsoon. The sacred order of the Vedas, which had shaped India's moral and cosmic imagination for 1,000 years, was fading. The priests still poured butter into sacred fires, but fewer believed that smoke could carry prayers to heaven. Across the Gangetic plain, change was visible everywhere. The forests that once covered the land had been cut back to make room for rice paddies and villages. Iron ploughs bit deeper into the earth, and irrigation canals brought prosperity to fields that had once depended solely on the rains. Trade routes connected the Himalayan foothills with the sea, carrying salt, spices, and fine textiles. Caravans moved with oxen and elephants, guarded by hired soldiers. Prosperity fed ambition, and ambition conflict. At the center of this world stood the Mahājanapadas, the great realms. There were 16 in all, each a world unto itself. To the east, Magadha was rising under the formidable rule of King Bimbisara, whose capital at Rajagraha was encircled by massive stone walls. To the west, Kosala, with its capital at Shravast, matched Magadha in power and pride. Between these giants lay smaller republics like the Lichavis, Mallas, and Shakyas, fiercely independent yet constantly under threat. The Shakyas' capital, Kapilavastu, was a modest city of brick courtyards and narrow streets, its surrounding countryside patterned with rice terraces and irrigation ditches. Unlike the kingdoms of the plains, Kapilavastu had no throne room or royal court. Governance rested in a council of elders drawn from the leading families. Decisions were made by debate, not decree. It was a fragile democracy in a world of monarchs, and it gave its citizens a rare sense of shared identity. The Shakyas were known for their discipline and simplicity. Men farmed their own fields and served as soldiers in time of war. Women oversaw households and temples dedicated to local spirits. They claimed descent from the ancient solar dynasty of Ikshvaku, a lineage more symbolic than political, but one that linked them to a golden past. Their leader, King Shuddhadana, ruled as first among equals, bound by the same laws that governed every clansman. Under his protection, the Shakya Republic endured like a small flame, sheltered from the winds of empire. Yet even here, the air was thick with uncertainty. The great rituals of the Vedic faith, the solemn sacrifices that had once bound heaven and earth, were losing their authority. For centuries, Brahmin priests had maintained the cosmic order by chanting hymns and offering fire to the gods. They spoke of Rita, the principle of harmony that kept the universe balanced. But to many, these ceremonies now seemed remote, their meaning lost in the repetition of words whose power few still felt. In their place arose a new kind of search. Teachers left their homes and wandered the forests, living on alms and sleeping under trees. They were called shramanas, those who strive. Some believed that release from suffering could be found through self-denial, by fasting and enduring pain. Others sought it through meditation and stillness. Some rejected all gods and all afterlives, insisting that only the senses revealed truth. There were those who argued that fate ruled everything, that freedom itself was an illusion, and others who claimed that all existence was illusion. It was a time when every idea, no matter how radical, could find a listener. Along the trade routes, travelers carried not only goods, but philosophies. In the marketplaces of Rajagra and Vaishal, merchants paused to hear wandering sages debate the nature of the soul. Wealthy patrons sponsored teachers, hoping that the next revelation might explain why wealth and power brought no peace. Amid this clamor of doctrines, the poets of the Upanishads began to speak in quieter tones. They asked not how to please the gods, but how to know the self. What is that by which all else is known? They asked. Their answer was revolutionary, that the inner self, Atman, was one with the ultimate reality, Brahman. Knowledge, not sacrifice, was the key to salvation. The fire altar was moving inward, from temple to mind. This intellectual revolution was mirrored by social change. The introduction of coinage gave rise to banking and trade guilds. Families of merchants and craftsmen began to challenge the authority of hereditary elites. The caste system, still forming in its early outlines, grew rigid at the top and restless below. While kings and priests clung to tradition, the common people adapted to the pace of a new age, one of iron, profit, and anxiety. The countryside bore the weight of this transformation. Farmers faced famine when the monsoons failed, and disease followed the crowded streets of growing cities. Death was everywhere, visible, intimate, inescapable. In such a world, questions of morality and meaning could not remain abstract. Why do the innocent suffer? Why does wealth vanish, youth fade, life end? These questions echoed through every class of society. For the Brahmin, they were a test of faith. For the ascetic, a doorway to truth. To the merchant, they were an unease that no amount of silver could silence. It was as if the entire civilization, after centuries of reciting the answers of the past, had finally realized that it did not understand the questions. In the midst of this great reawakening, the Shakyas continued their quiet existence at the edge of empire. They farmed their lands, held their councils, and raised their children under the long shadow of the Himalayas. But destiny was already moving among them, unseen, inevitable. Within the palace of King Shuddhodana, a dream would soon visit his queen, a white elephant descending from the heavens, offering her a lotus. From that vision would come the birth of a child whose life would bridge two worlds, the fading age of sacrifice and the dawning age of self-knowledge. The forests were dark, the cities restless, and the mind of India aflame with questions. The world was ready for Siddhartha. Night had fallen softly over Kapilavastu. Inside the palace, Queen Maya dreamed. From the high terraces, she saw the heavens open, and a radiant white elephant descend through clouds of light, holding a lotus in its trunk. It circled her 3 times, and entered her side without pain or fear. When she awoke, she felt a calm unlike any she had ever known, a quiet certainty that the dream was not of this world. The next morning, she told her husband, King Shuddhodana, what she had seen. He summoned Brahmin sages to interpret the vision. They listened in silence, then spoke with reverence. "A son will be born to you, great among men. He will become either a universal monarch, a conqueror of nations, or a teacher who will conquer the world through wisdom." The words carried both joy and unease. Shuddhodana, proud ruler of the Shakyas, longed for the first prophecy. He imagined his son uniting the clans, expanding their borders, and carving a legacy that would rival the great empires of Kosala and Magadha. Yet the sages warned that if the boy saw sorrow, age, sickness, or death, he would renounce the world. The king swore silently that such sights would never reach him. Months passed. When the queen's time came, she journeyed to her family's home, as was custom, to give birth among her kin. On the way, the royal caravan stopped in the Lumbinshta Grove, a sacred garden near the border of present-day Nepal. It was spring. The air was warm, the trees heavy with blossoms. As Maya reached up to steady herself against a branch, the child was born, standing upright, radiant, and silent. Legends say that he took 7 steps and spoke, "This is my last birth." Whether the story is history or metaphor, its meaning endures, the promise of liberation through understanding. When word reached Kapilavastu, the city erupted in celebration. Priests chanted hymns, drums echoed from the gates, and messengers carried news across the republic. But 7 days later, joy turned to mourning. Queen Maya died suddenly, perhaps from fever, perhaps from exhaustion. Her sister, Mahāparinibbāna Gautama, took the infant in her arms and raised him as her own. The child was named Siddhartha, he who has achieved his purpose. He was born into privilege, but from his first breath, loss shadowed him. The stillness that would later define the Buddha's presence began here, in a cradle touched by both birth and death. Shuddhodana devoted himself to ensuring that no shadow touched his son again. He built new palaces, filled them with gardens, music, and the scent of lotus pools. From infancy, Siddhartha's life was wrapped in beauty. Attendants guarded his every step. Musicians followed him from chamber to chamber. He wore silk even in childhood and was never allowed to see the frailty of age or the pain of illness. According to the chronicles, the king's ministers selected servants so young that none bore wrinkles or scars. The old and the sick were kept from sight. The air within the palace was a mirror of eternal youth, an illusion of perfection meant to guard the prince's destiny. But destiny is not so easily deceived. Even as a boy, Siddhartha was quiet, observant, and questioning. He watched the ritual fires in the palace courtyards and asked why so much grain and oil were burned for invisible gods. When told it maintained cosmic balance, he would nod, but his eyes betrayed doubt. Under the guidance of Brahmin tutors, he mastered the arts of reading, debate, and philosophy. He learned the sacred verses of the Vedas and the reasoning of the new thinkers of his time. He was trained in archery, swordsmanship, and the chariot races that were the pride of the Shakya youth. Yet nothing stirred him more than solitude, the silence of the gardens at dawn, the sight of the river mist over Kapilavastu. The court spoke of him as gifted but detached. Unlike other princes, he did not boast or quarrel. When he won contests of strength or skill, he did so with grace, almost reluctance. When praised, he smiled politely and turned his gaze elsewhere. It was said that even as a child, he he seemed to be listening to something no one else could hear. Shuddhadana, determined to secure his son's future, arranged his marriage early. The bride was Yasodhara, his cousin, graceful, educated, and his equal in mind. Their union brought joy to the court and peace to the king, who believed this would anchor the prince to worldly life. The wedding was celebrated with days of feasting and music, a moment of harmony in an age of unease. For a time, the king's hopes seemed fulfilled. The young couple lived surrounded by luxury, palaces designed for each season, ponds of red and blue lotus, corridors perfumed with jasmine. Yasodhara adored her husband, and the people of Kapilavastu admired him. When their son, Rahula, was born, Shuddhadana rejoiced, the continuation of the Gautama line assured. Yet beneath this perfection, Siddhartha's silence deepened. The dream that had marked his birth seemed to linger over him. At times he would sit motionless for hours, watching the flicker of lamps or the movement of clouds. When musicians played, he listened not to the melody, but to the pauses between notes. He had everything his father could give him, and yet something remained unfulfilled. The contrast between the sheltered life inside the palace and the turmoil outside its walls grew sharper with each year. The Shakya Republic faced tension with neighboring powers. Merchants complained of new taxes. Wandering ascetics passed through the gates, preaching renunciation. Though the prince never met them, their presence was felt like a wind from another world, the whisper of an unseen horizon. Shuddhadana redoubled his efforts to protect his son's innocence. Festivals, entertainments, and pleasures filled every season. The palace became both cradle and cage, a world of abundance designed to keep one truth hidden, that every joy is impermanent. As Siddhartha's childhood gave way to youth, his calm became more pronounced, his curiosity sharper. He spoke little, yet his questions, when asked, startled his teachers. "If all things change," he once said, "then why do men cling to them?" The question passed like a breeze through the palace, unsettling, forgotten, yet impossible to erase. The palace would soon become too small for his questions. Siddhartha Gautama had grown into manhood surrounded by everything his father could imagine: music, gardens, feasts, and endless delight. Kapilavastu, once a modest capital of a mountain republic, had become a world built entirely for him. Its courtyards were swept each morning, its lotus ponds filled with fresh blossoms, and its halls echoed with musicians playing for the prince's amusement. He was the promise of the Shakya line, the pride of King Shuddhadana and Queen Mahāparinibbāna. Handsome, disciplined, and unfailingly courteous, Siddhartha embodied every virtue expected of a ruler. He excelled in archery, chariot racing, and philosophy. His tutors declared him unsurpassed. Yet the more he learned, the quieter he became. Shuddhadana believed that knowledge was not enough, that pleasure would secure what study could not. He ordered 3 palaces built for his son, one for each season of the year. In the heat of summer, Siddhartha lived among cool marble pools and fountains that ran day and night. In the monsoon, he was surrounded by dancers and musicians, the air rich with perfume and laughter. In winter, fires glowed through corridors hung with silk, and his chambers were lined with the softest rugs and furs. The king's reasoning was simple. If the prince's heart were filled with joy, he would have no reason to look beyond the palace walls. For a time, it seemed to work. Siddhartha accepted the world as it was given to him. He attended festivals, rode his chariot in parades, and performed his duties at court. The people admired his grace, and the young nobles sought his friendship. Yet even amid celebration, there was distance in his gaze, an attention fixed on something beyond the moment. When the musicians played, he listened intently, but when the last note faded, he did not clap. He simply stared at the instrument, as if wondering where the sound had gone. Servants whispered that the prince was too serious, too thoughtful for his age. Others said he was born under a strange sign, destined for greatness, but not for rule. His wife, Yasodhara, understood him better than anyone. She was as intelligent as she was graceful, trained in philosophy and poetry. Together they shared a calm affection, free from the vanity that surrounded the court. Their son, Rahula, was born after years of quiet companionship, bringing both pride and fear to King Shuddhodana. Pride for the continuation of the Gautama line, and fear that fatherhood might remind Siddhartha of the world's fragility. The king ordered new entertainments, lavish festivals, and processions to mark the child's birth. Yet even in celebration, the same thought haunted him: the prophecy. The sages had warned that if Siddhartha ever saw human suffering, he would abandon the world. Shuddhodana therefore renewed his vigilance. The palace gates were guarded at all hours. The old, the sick, and the infirm were forbidden to appear within sight of the prince. Roads were swept clean before he passed. Musicians were chosen for their beauty, servants for their youth. Within the walls, life was a painting, flawless but without shadow. Outside, the world was different. Drought and disease visited the farms beyond the city. Merchants brought stories of famine from the eastern plains. Wanderers from distant kingdoms passed through the markets, speaking of unrest and war. But none of this reached the prince's ears. In Shuddhodana's mind, ignorance was protection, and protection, love. Yet Siddhartha's mind was never still. In quiet moments, he watched the gardeners at work, pruning and planting, and asked them why flowers withered so soon after blooming. They had no answer. In the stillness of his rooms, he watched candles burn down to stubs, their wax pooling like the years of a life. The thought unsettled him, though he could not yet say why. He continued to fulfill his role: husband, father, noble. He presided over ceremonies, received petitions, and trained in governance. But the rituals of power felt empty, their repetition masking a question that grew louder in his mind. A question he could not name, but could no longer ignore. At night, while the palace slept, Siddhartha would walk the terraces in silence. The lamps of Kapilavastu flickered below, like constellations reflected in the earth. Somewhere beyond those walls lay the rest of the Shakya Republic, farmers, craftsmen, and ascetics wandering through the dark forests. He wondered what their lives were like, what they feared, what they sought. Yasodhara noticed the change in him. She asked if he was ill. He smiled and said no. She asked if he was unhappy. He said nothing. It was not unhappiness that stirred him, but a restlessness without form, the first stirring of a truth that would one day drive him beyond the gates of his world. Shuddhodana mistook this calm for contentment and grew confident. He saw his son hold Rahula, walk beside his wife, and speak kindly to his servants, and he believed the danger had passed. The prophecy, he told himself, had been averted. The prince was bound to life by love. But love, for Siddhartha, was not a chain. It was a mirror, a reflection of the impermanence he sensed in everything. Each joy was shadowed by the fear of its loss. Each birth carried the whisper of death. He did not turn away from these thoughts. He studied them quietly, as though they were lessons waiting to be understood. In the 30th year of his father's reign, the Shakya court flourished. Kapilavastu glowed with prosperity, its granaries full and its temples active. Festivals of music and light were held each month to honor the gods and display the wealth of the realm. Siddhartha attended as duty demanded, yet he moved through the crowds like a man observing a dream, aware of its beauty but knowing it would soon end. Those who watched him saw only serenity. Few could imagine that beneath that serenity was the beginning of doubt, a doubt that would soon open the path to enlightenment. Beyond the palace walls, the city stirred before dawn. Caravans assembled for trade. Monks walked the roads barefoot, and the distant cries of beggars echoed through the streets. One morning, Siddhartha would ask to see what lay beyond those walls, and the four sights that awaited him would change not only his life, but the understanding of suffering itself. What once seemed flawless began to break, softly and unseen. After years of contentment within the walled world his father had built, Siddhartha Gautama felt a slow unease that no festival or melody could calm. The palace was radiant with color and sound, yet beneath its surface he sensed the faint pulse of impermanence. Each evening, when the musicians withdrew and the lamps guttered low, silence filled the corridors like an unanswered question. King Shuddhodana had promised the sages that his son would never glimpse sorrow. He believed that ignorance was protection and that beauty could shelter the mind from doubt. But no wall, however high, can keep life itself from entering. The prince asked to visit the city. The request was innocent enough, but to the king it sounded like destiny knocking at the gate. Reluctantly he agreed. Messengers swept the streets, hiding the frail and the sick, ordering the poor to remain indoors. Kapilavastu was polished into an image of eternal youth. When the morning came, Siddhartha rode out with his companion, Channa. The world he encountered at first matched his father's dream. Bright stalls filled with grain and cloth, the hum of trade, the laughter of children. For a brief moment, the perfection seemed real. Then, as the chariot turned a corner, the illusion tore. An old man stood by the roadside, his body bent, his hair white as dust, his skin drawn tight around his bones. The sight was simple, almost ordinary, yet to Siddhartha it was as foreign as another planet. The weight of years was something he had never seen. In that instant, he understood that time was not kind, that beauty waned, and that he too would one day bow beneath the same invisible hand. The certainty of youth faltered. Days later, he asked to go out again. The courtiers obeyed, though uneasily. This time the prince saw a man racked by disease. The body that had once walked upright now trembled under its own weight. Pain had stripped it of dignity. No one needed to explain what he was seeing. The reality of suffering had entered his mind, and it would never leave. A third journey followed, and with it the most final of revelations. Outside the city, villagers carried a body wrapped in linen toward the cremation ground. Smoke from the funeral pyres drifted on the wind. The prince watched in silence. Death was not a story or a warning. It was the inevitable end of all things that live. He returned to the palace changed, moving through the marble halls as though through the shell of a dream. Shuddhodana redoubled his efforts to drown his son's thoughts in pleasure. The palace glowed with new music, new dancers, new distractions. Yet to Siddhartha, the laughter around him sounded distant, almost hollow. He had seen the cycle that bound every creature: birth, decay, and dissolution. No feast could erase that vision. One evening, seeking quiet after another celebration, he walked alone through the royal gardens. At the far gate, he noticed a solitary figure approaching along the dusty road, a wanderer clothed in simple cloth, barefoot, carrying nothing but a begging bowl. His movements were slow but assured, his face neither proud nor fearful. The man's calm seemed untouched by the change and decay that haunted the world. Siddhartha watched him pass, and for the first time since childhood, a sense of direction entered his heart. Age, sickness, and death had shown him the inevitability of loss. This final sight offered a response, a life stripped of illusion, seeking truth rather than comfort. That night, the prince did not sleep. He walked the terraces until dawn, hearing the city stir beneath him. Every sound seemed both familiar and newly strange. The calls of merchants, the clang of tools, the lowing of cattle. All of it was life in motion, unending and fragile. He understood that his father's walls had not protected him from suffering. They had merely postponed the moment when he would recognize it. The 4 encounters formed a single revelation. They were not miracles, but mirrors reflecting the condition of all existence. To live was to change was to suffer, and yet within that truth lay the seed of liberation. The awareness of impermanence was painful, but it was also a kind of clarity, a doorway opening in the mind. When the first light touched the roofs of Kapilavastu, Siddhartha stood watching it from the balcony where his childhood had begun. The city shone gold in the sunrise. The same streets he had walked with innocence now charged with meaning. Behind him, the palace still slept. Before him stretched the world as it truly was. He no longer sought to escape the sight of suffering. He sought to understand it. In the quiet that followed, revelation came resolve. The prince would no longer live sheltered from the truth he had seen. Before another moon had passed, the heir of the Shakyas would step into the night and exchange the life of privilege for the life of a seeker. As dawn crept over Kapilavastu in pale bands of light, the city awoke to the sounds of the marketplace. The creak of carts, the cries of traders, the murmur of a people beginning their day. In the palace, lamps still burned from the night's revels. Siddhartha Gautama stood at his window and watched the world return to motion, knowing that he no longer belonged to it. The visions that had once struck him like blows had settled into clarity. Age, sickness, and death were not intrusions into life. They were life's defining pattern. The fragile pleasures that his father offered were no answer, for they too were bound to vanish. The old man, the diseased body, the funeral fire, each had shown him the same truth. Everything that arises must pass away. Only understanding could offer peace. Shuddhadana sensed the change, but could not read its depth. He saw a son who was quiet, dutiful, serene, and mistook acceptance for contentment. He summoned counselors and astrologers, hoping for reassurance, but even they hesitated. The prophecy spoken at Siddhartha's birth, that he would become either a ruler or a spiritual teacher, had returned to haunt him. The king filled the palace with diversions. Musicians played through the afternoons. Courtiers devised new entertainments, and festivals followed one another with mechanical cheer. Yet the prince moved through these gatherings as if through a fading dream. He laughed politely, spoke when addressed, and afterward retreated into solitude. Within him, a decision was forming, slow, complete, and without anger. The life he had known could not answer the questions that now defined him. To seek their answer, he would have to give up everything that tied him to comfort and name. As night fell one evening, the moon rose over the fields beyond the palace walls. Siddhartha walked the corridors in silence, each footstep echoing faintly against the stone. Servants bowed as he passed, unaware that they were seeing him for the last time. In his private chambers, his wife Yasodhara slept beside their infant son. The child's breathing was soft and rhythmic, the small, contented sound of a life untouched by care. Siddhartha stood in the doorway for a long time, watching them. Every instinct of love urged him to stay, yet love itself demanded truth. To remain would be to live blind. To leave was to risk everything, including the very people he loved. He understood that compassion sometimes requires distance, that one cannot lift another from sorrow while remaining bound to one's own attachments. He turned away. The sound of the wind through the curtains seemed to follow him like a voice of farewell. In the courtyard, his horse Kantaka waited, and the charioteer Channa stood beside it. The prince's intention had been known only to a few, and Channa was among them. There were no words between them, only the recognition of what was about to happen. Siddhartha mounted, and they rode through the sleeping city. The moonlight painted the walls silver. The streets lay empty, except for the distant barking of dogs. At the northern gate, 2 guards watched their approach. They bowed low, as they always had, and stepped aside. They could not know that the heir of the Shakyas was passing into history. The road beyond the city was quiet, stretching toward the dark line of forest that bordered the plain. When they reached the edge of the woods, Siddhartha drew rein and dismounted. He looked back once. The lights of Kapilavastu shimmered faintly on the horizon, fragile as reflections on water. Then he removed his ornaments, his sword, his earrings, all the marks of royalty, and placed them in Channa's hands. From his shoulder, he took the silken cloak that had protected him from the wind and folded it carefully. His hair, tied in the knot of a nobleman, he cut with his own blade and let fall into the dust. What remained was not a prince, but a seeker, stripped of privilege and purpose alike. "Return these to my father," he said quietly. "Tell him that I seek not rebellion, but release." Channa wept, but obeyed. As he rode back toward the sleeping city, Siddhartha stood alone beside the forest path. The night around him was immense. For the first time, there were no walls, no servants, no expectations, only the vast breadth of the world and the slow rustle of leaves. He walked until the darkness began to pale. At the banks of the Anoma River, he knelt to drink. The water was cold and clear, flowing past reeds and stones toward the distant sea. When he rose, the first light of dawn caught the edge of his robe. Coarse, plain, the color of dust. He felt no fear, only a deep stillness. The life he had left behind seemed like a story told to someone else. As the sun climbed higher, he began to walk. Villagers saw a solitary man moving along the road, his face calm, his step deliberate. Some offered food, others stared, uncomprehending. The prince of the Shakyas had become one of the wanderers he had once observed from the safety of his chariot. The journey that would define his life had begun. That evening, Siddhartha found shelter under a tree at the edge of a field. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke from distant hearths. He ate the handful of grain that a farmer's wife had placed in his bowl, then sat in meditation, the fading light touching his face. The first day of freedom was not triumph, but clarity. He possessed nothing, yet felt nearer to understanding than ever before. He realized that renunciation was not an act of rejection, but of recognition, that nothing in the world could be truly owned, and therefore nothing could be truly lost. As night returned, he looked toward the horizon where the palace lights had disappeared. The silence between him and that world was complete, but it was not empty. It was full of possibility. Weeks later, the solitary wanderer reached the lands of the Ganges Valley. where ascetics gathered in forests and scholars debated the nature of the soul. Among them were teachers of great renown, men who promised liberation through meditation or austerity. Siddhartha would follow them, learn from them, and finally go further than any of them dared to go. The young wanderer entered a land of dust and silence. Across the plains of the Ganges, hermitages and forest communities dotted the countryside, small clearings where men and women had withdrawn from the world to seek truth in their own way. To some, the pursuit meant stillness and meditation. To others, it meant punishment of the body until the mind rose above pain. Siddhartha Gautama walked among them as one seeker among thousands. He had left behind power, name, and family, yet found himself in a society devoted entirely to the search for liberation. The India of his time was rich in thought, but poor in certainty. Each forest settlement offered a different doctrine. Each teacher claimed to hold the final key. He came first to the hermitage of Alara Kalama, a man revered for his knowledge of deep meditation. There, among disciples who lived on little more than fruit and water, Siddhartha learned to still his mind until perception itself seemed to fade. For hours he would sit unmoving, following each breath until consciousness dissolved into a vast and luminous quiet. The state brought peace, but not release. When the trance ended, desire and ignorance returned. Alara's method led to serenity, but not to understanding, and Siddhartha moved on. Further east, he joined the followers of Uddaka Ramaputta, whose teachings aimed at the total transcendence of thought. Under his discipline, Siddhartha mastered the deepest levels of concentration known to the age. His teachers recognized his skill and invited him to remain as an equal. But again, he felt the incompleteness of what he had achieved. The highest states of mind still depended on effort. They faded when attention broke. The freedom he sought had to lie elsewhere, beyond the cycle of achievement and loss. Leaving the hermitages, he turned south toward the village of Uruvela, near the banks of the Neranjara River. The forest there was dense, the air heavy with the smell of rain and earth. Other ascetics had settled nearby, drawn by its isolation and its proximity to the ancient pilgrimage routes. Here, Siddhartha began the most severe phase of his search. He practiced austerities so extreme that his body wasted away. Food became a single grain of rice, water a few drops from the palm. For hours he stood unmoving under the sun. At night, he sat among thorns or on beds of nails. Weeks turned to months. His skin clung to his bones. His veins rose like cords. His breath grew shallow. He sought to conquer the senses by destroying the body that carried them. The discipline brought visions, faint and shifting, glimpses of purity that vanished as soon as they appeared. The pain that filled his limbs never led to knowledge, only to exhaustion. The others who lived near him, impressed by his endurance, called him the foremost of ascetics. Yet within himself he knew he was no nearer to understanding than when he had begun. The thought came to him gradually, clear as a bell at dawn, that the path of torment was only another form of attachment. To cling to suffering was no different from clinging to pleasure. Both kept the mind fixed on the body. Freedom, he realized, could not depend on indulgence or denial. It required balance, a state of discipline without cruelty, attention without obsession. His companions, who had followed him in austerity, were horrified when he began to eat again. They believed he had betrayed the practice and turned back toward weakness. Siddhartha, however, felt life returning to him as strength, not indulgence. A young woman from the nearby village offered him a bowl of rice boiled in milk. He accepted it without pride or shame. The act, simple and human, restored his vitality, and marked the end of an era of error. In the following days, he regained the strength to walk to the river. The rains had ended, and the Neranjara flowed wide and calm between its banks. He bathed, cleansing the dust of years from his body. The forest shimmered in the sun, alive with birds and insects. Everything around him, the water, the light, the sound of wind through the reeds, seemed connected by an order deeper than effort. He sat beneath a tree and considered the course of his journey. He had known the luxury of princes and the agony of hermits. Both extremes had failed to bring release. The truth, he now sensed, must lie in the still center between them, a middle way that neither grasped at the world nor fled from it. As he reflected, the 5 ascetics who had once followed him turned away, convinced that he had fallen from the path. They left Uruvela and journeyed north, certain that his experiment was over. In the history of religion, few moments would prove more ironic. The man they abandoned would soon become the teacher they sought. When evening came, Siddhartha looked across the river toward a grove of fig trees that grew on the opposite bank. The largest among them cast a shadow like a canopy across the earth. The sight stirred a quiet recognition, a sense that his long wandering was drawing to a close. He rose, gathered his robe, and began to walk toward it. The years of effort, the teachings of others, the pain of hunger and the memory of luxury all seemed to converge in a single point of stillness. He had left behind the world to find its truth. Now the search itself was about to end. As dusk settled over the forests of Uruvela, Siddhartha sat beneath the spreading branches of a fig tree, resolved not to rise until he had seen the nature of existence as it truly was. In that stillness, the long struggle of the seeker gave way to the quiet of awakening. Evening descended over the forests of Uruvela. The air was warm, and the river ran slow and full from the monsoon rains. Across the clearing stood a fig tree, whose crown spread wide and low, its roots twisted through the soil like veins of stone. Siddhartha Gautama sat at its base and crossed his legs upon the earth. His body was lean from years of austerity, but his mind was calm. He had resolved not to rise again until he understood the nature of life and its release from suffering. The moment had no ceremony. The world around him moved as it always had. The rhythm of insects, the soft pulse of wind through leaves, the distant cry of animals along the river. Yet within that ordinary stillness lay the final movement of a long journey. The prince who had once lived among gold and music had wandered through hunger, pain, and doubt. Now he sat without expectation. Effort had carried him as far as it could. What remained was clarity. Night gathered slowly. The shadows deepened, and the forest turned to dark water around him. Thought after thought rose and faded like ripples on a pond. Fear appeared, then passed. Desire stirred, then fell silent. Each emotion revealed its nature, each illusion its impermanence. The mind that had once strained toward heaven turned inward, seeing the world not as fragments, but as a single, continuous movement. Birth giving rise to death, death giving rise to birth, bound together by ignorance and craving. The struggle that followed was not with demons or gods, but with memory itself, the reflex to cling, to resist, to exist. For hours the contest held, until understanding began to form. The chain of existence he saw was neither fate nor punishment, but a process sustained by ignorance. To see its pattern clearly was to step outside it. As the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the world appeared changed, though nothing in it had moved. The river shimmered, the air smelled of rain and earth, and the birds began to stir. The moment of awakening was not a revelation from without, but a recognition from within. The search for a truth apart from the world had ended. The truth was the world itself, seen without fear or desire. Siddhartha's mind became vast and still. He saw the endless cycle of beings rising and passing away, the causes of their sorrow and the means of their release. Compassion flowed naturally from this vision, not as sentiment, but as understanding. To know the nature of suffering was to feel its weight in all creatures. When the sun rose fully, he opened his eyes. The morning light fell through the branches in scattered gold, and the river seemed to carry its reflection toward the sea. He remained seated for a long time, the rhythm of his breath matching the rhythm of the world around him. The struggle was finished. The seeker had found no object of worship, no revelation of a god, but a state of insight, clear, selfless, and unbound. In later generations, the fig tree would be called the Bodhi tree, and the man who sat beneath it would be known as the Buddha, the awakened one. Yet in that moment, there was no title, no witness, only awareness. He had discovered that liberation was not an escape from life, but a direct comprehension of it, that the mind which sees clearly is free, even while the body endures change and decay. For 7 days, he remained near the tree, absorbed in the peace that followed understanding. Each day, he gazed upon the river, the forest, and the sky, seeing in them the same quiet order. He traced the movement of cause and effect that bound the smallest insect to the greatest star, and saw that all things were held together by interdependence. Nothing existed alone. He remembered the teachers who had guided him, the kings who ruled their cities, the farmers who worked the soil, the beggars, the merchants, the dancers, the sick and the dying. All were travelers in the same current, drawn onward by the same ignorance, searching for the same rest. He had sought truth for himself, but what he found belonged to all. When at last he rose, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The years of wandering and self-denial had led not to a vision of heaven, but to a recognition of the world's ordinary holiness. Every life, however brief, was part of the same unfolding. Every act of kindness, every moment of clarity was a step out of blindness. The struggle of existence was not something to be escaped, but to be understood, and through understanding, transformed. Siddhartha stood, lifted his robe, and looked toward the open country where villages lay along the river's edge. The path before him was simple: to share what he had seen. The wisdom that had ended his search now demanded a new labor: to speak to those still caught in the circle he had escaped. He gathered his bowl and walked toward the horizon. The morning was bright, the air clear after the long rains. The forest behind him returned to its quiet hum, but the silence that went with him was of another kind, the stillness of a man who had ceased to wander within himself. Weeks later, the solitary figure reached the roads leading north toward the ancient deer park at Sarnath. There, the first hearers of his words would become the first community of his followers, and the understanding gained beneath the Bodhi tree would take form as a teaching that would reshape the thought of Asia. In the weeks that followed his awakening, Siddhartha Gautama wandered the forests near Uruvela in quiet contemplation. His mind was calm, his senses untroubled. The long search for truth had ended, yet its result felt almost fragile in its simplicity. What he had discovered could not be contained in words, and yet words were now the only means to share it. He considered remaining in solitude, dwelling forever in the peace of realization. The life of renunciation had given him freedom from the world's noise and illusion, but understanding carried its own responsibility. Knowledge that ended suffering could not be kept as a private treasure. Compassion, born of insight, demanded expression. In that same season, 5 wanderers who had once followed him in austerity were living near the city of Benares. They had left him at Uruvela when he turned away from self-mortification, believing that he had abandoned the quest. Hearing rumors of his awakening, they were skeptical but curious. Their meeting would mark the first moment when Siddhartha's silence gave way to speech. He set out on foot toward the north. The path traced the course of the Ganges, winding through fields newly green after the rains. Villagers offered him food. Farmers paused in their work to watch him pass. He accepted each gesture without attachment, neither rejecting nor seeking favor. In his presence, there was something unmistakable, a stillness that seemed to quiet the air itself. After several days, he reached a small forest known as the Deer Park at Sarnath. The 5 ascetics saw him approaching along the path and were at first unwilling to greet him. Yet as he drew nearer, their resolve softened. There was nothing of pride or hunger in his bearing, only calm purpose. The man they had once known as a companion in hardship now seemed to embody the peace they had sought and failed to find. They asked what he had discovered, and he answered not as a philosopher defending a theory, but as one describing the nature of water to those who thirst. Suffering, he explained, was not the punishment of gods or the result of sin, but a condition inherent in existence itself. All things arise, change, and pass away. To cling to them is to suffer. The cause of this sorrow lies in craving, the desire for permanence in a world of flux. Liberation comes not through denial of life, but through the understanding of it, and through the cessation of craving that understanding brings. This was the essence of his first teaching, the framework that later generations would call the 4 Noble Truths. The first recognized the reality of suffering. The second identified its cause in desire and ignorance. The third affirmed that release was possible. The fourth outlined the path leading toward that release, a discipline of ethical conduct, mental concentration, and insight, a middle way between indulgence and mortification. The 5 wanderers listened in silence. What they heard was not revelation, but recognition, a description of life as they themselves had experienced it. The truth did not command belief. It invited verification through practice. In that moment, their doubt yielded to comprehension. The search that had carried them across years of hunger and uncertainty found its direction again. From that day, Siddhartha was no longer a solitary seeker. The understanding born under the Bodhi tree took form as a living community. The 5 ascetics became the first members of a fellowship devoted to the discipline of awakening, the Sangha. Together, they lived simply, moving from village to village, accepting food in silence and teaching those who asked. The Buddha, as he was now called, established no temple and claimed no divine authority. His message was a way of seeing rather than a creed, a practice rather than a revelation. The small group at Sarnath grew quickly. Merchants, laborers, and scholars joined them. Kings and courtiers sought their counsel. The path of moderation, practical and humane, appealed to those disillusioned with the rival extremes of luxury and austerity. The early monks carried nothing but a robe and a bowl, living by the generosity of others. Their lives were governed by restraint and mutual respect. They taught not through conversion, but through example, demonstrating that freedom was possible even in the midst of change. The world of northern India was ready for such a message. The kingdoms along the Ganges were rich but restless, filled with conflict and ambition. The Brahmin rituals had grown remote from the needs of ordinary people, and the new philosophies offered more speculation than solace. Against this backdrop, the Buddha's teaching appeared as a third way, a rejection of both dogma and despair. In the months that followed, the Sangha became a visible presence along the roads and in the marketplaces. Their saffron robes and quiet demeanor distinguished them from the wandering ascetics who practiced extreme penance. They spoke of mindfulness, compassion, and the impermanence of all things. The Buddha moved among them as a teacher rather than a master, guiding through example, not command. The revolution he had begun was inward, yet its effects would ripple outward for centuries. By the time the rains returned, the community at Sarnath had grown into the first monastic order of India. They spent the wet season in shelters made of reeds and clay, reciting and preserving the new teaching. When the skies cleared, they set out again across the plains, carrying the message that liberation was not a distant promise, but a condition of the mind, available in the present moment to all who understood. The wheel of doctrine, the symbol that would come to represent his path, had begun to turn. It would never cease. The rains ended, and the roads of northern India opened once more. Fields gleamed with water, the air heavy with the scent of growth. Across this renewed landscape, a quiet movement began to take shape. A network of wandering monks carrying a single idea, that freedom from suffering lay not in gods or sacrifices, but in understanding. The Sangha, though small at first, expanded rapidly. Wherever they walked, the sight of their ochre robes drew curiosity. They travelled without possessions, living on the charity of those they met. Their presence challenged the assumptions of the age, that status determined worth, that rituals secured purity, that peace could be bought through offerings. The Buddha's disciples lived by another measure: restraint, reflection, and compassion. Siddhartha Gautama, now known simply as the Buddha, continued his journey along the Ganges Valley. His purpose was neither conquest nor conversion, but communication. To make the truth he had seen accessible to all, he moved with no retinue, resting beneath trees, sleeping in village outskirts, teaching in marketplaces and courtyards. His words were concise, pragmatic, stripped of superstition. He spoke of cause and effect, of the impermanence of life, of the capacity within every human being to awaken from ignorance. In the kingdom of Magadha, his reputation reached King Bimbisara, a ruler renowned for both ambition and intelligence. Curious about the new teacher, the king invited him to his capital, Rajagriha. There, in the shade of the bamboo grove, they met. A monarch burdened by power, and a mendicant free of possessions. The encounter was courteous and thoughtful. The king recognized the clarity of the Buddha's vision and offered him a place for his growing community to reside. The grove became the first permanent refuge of the Sangha, a place of rest during the monsoon months. From this base, the Buddha's message spread swiftly through the plains. Merchants carried it along trade routes. Farmers repeated it in village gatherings. It appealed to those weary of the rigid hierarchies of caste and the costly rituals of the Brahmins. In a world defined by birth and privilege, the Buddha's teaching suggested that wisdom was the true measure of nobility. A person's worth, he taught, was determined by conduct and understanding, not lineage. Among the early followers was Yasa, the son of a wealthy merchant. Disenchanted with luxury, he sought the Buddha at dawn one morning and found him seated in meditation near the riverbank. The young man joined the Sangha, and his example drew many others from his city. Friends, servants, even his parents, who became supporters of the new order. The Sangha's structure evolved to accommodate this diversity. Monks who renounced the world, and lay followers who sustained them. Together, they formed a living expression of interdependence, bound not by creed, but by mutual generosity. The Buddha's way of teaching remained direct and unsentimental. He refused metaphysical speculation, dismissing questions that did not lead to the end of suffering. His instruction emphasized observation rather than belief, the awareness of thought and sensation as transient events, the practice of right speech, right action, and right livelihood. By these disciplines, the mind could be cleared of greed, hatred, and delusion, the three roots of misery. Wherever he went, people gathered to hear him. Farmers from the fields, potters from their wheels, merchants from their caravans. He used the language of everyday life, drawing analogies from nature and work rather than scripture. The clarity of his words made him accessible to both scholar and laborer. Yet his presence carried a gravity that silenced argument. To be near him was to feel the possibility of calm. In the city of Vaishal, courtesans and noblewomen came to listen. Among them, the celebrated Ambapal, whose beauty and intelligence had made her both admired and envied. She offered her gardens as a retreat for the monks, transforming a place of pleasure into one of contemplation. Such acts of generosity from all levels of society gave the Sangha a foundation broader than any sect before it. The movement grew not through conquest, but through persuasion. The Buddha sent his disciples in pairs to different regions, instructing them to live simply and teach by example. They carried no weapons, performed no miracles, and made no demands. Their authority rested entirely on conduct. The calm discipline of their lives was the most persuasive argument they possessed. Over time, the Sangha became a recognized presence in nearly every city of the Gangetic Plain. Its members gathered during the rainy season to share experiences and recite the teachings from memory. The Buddha, when present, listened rather than commanded, ensuring the words remained consistent. Out of this oral discipline emerged the first body of doctrine, concise, rhythmic, and easily memorized. As the Sangha expanded, so did its challenges. Jealous rivals accused the monks of subverting social order, and some local priests denounced the Buddha as a heretic. Yet opposition rarely turned violent. The new path was too moderate to provoke fear, too disciplined to invite contempt. Even those who disagreed with its principles found it difficult to ignore the dignity of its followers. By the middle years of his ministry, the Buddha was known throughout the northern plains. He moved between kingdoms without escort, welcomed in some courts, tolerated in others, always teaching the same principle, that understanding rather than belief was the foundation of peace. The power of his message lay in its accessibility. It offered no salvation by divine favor, only the liberation that came from seeing the world clearly. As seasons passed, the sight of ochre robes walking the roads of India became familiar. Farmers left food by the paths. Children greeted the monks with curiosity and respect. The Sangha's presence transformed the moral landscape as surely as the rivers transformed the soil, quietly, persistently, without need of force. The man who had once left Kapilavastu as a solitary wanderer had now become the center of a movement that reached from the Himalayan foothills to the ports of the Eastern Sea. He neither claimed divinity nor sought disciples, yet his vision had already begun to alter the imagination of a civilization. The Dharma, once a single understanding beneath a fig tree, had become a living current in the world, and as it moved through villages and kingdoms alike, it carried with it the quiet conviction that the end of suffering was not distant or mysterious, but as close as the mind that chose to see. As the years unfolded, the Buddha's community matured into an enduring institution. The Sangha now numbered in the thousands. Monks and nuns walked the same roads that merchants traveled, stopping in towns and villages to beg for food and offer guidance. The discipline of their conduct, modest, methodical, and restrained, made them a familiar sight across the northern plains. The Buddha, moving continually among them, remained the still point of this growing movement. Yet no community, however disciplined, could remain untouched by rivalry and ambition. Among those drawn to the order was a kinsman of the Buddha named Devadatta. In his youth, he had been intelligent, gifted, and admired. He entered the Sangha early, mastered its discipline, and soon earned a reputation for austerity and eloquence. Many believed that his devotion matched that of his cousin. Over time, admiration turned to envy. The Buddha's serenity, that quiet authority born of understanding rather than command, became for Devadatta an object of resentment. As the Sangha expanded, it attracted both genuine seekers and opportunists. Kings and merchants offered patronage. Monasteries were built to house the growing numbers. The order that had begun as a circle of wanderers now possessed land, structures, and influence. Devadatta saw in this change the opportunity for power. To some, he presented himself as a reformer, arguing that the discipline had grown lax, that the community needed stricter rules. Monks should live only in the forest, eat once a day, wear only rags, and refuse all invitations to the houses of lay people. To others, his intentions appeared less pure. He sought control, not purification. When the Buddha declined to impose these new restrictions, Devadatta's discontent hardened into open rivalry. He gathered a following among younger monks and began to present himself as the future leader of the order. His ambition soon extended beyond reform. In the courts of kings, he sought allies who might strengthen his position. One such ruler, Ajatashatru of Magadha, was young, impulsive, and eager to assert his independence from his father, King Bimbisara, a devoted supporter of the Buddha. Devadatta's influence over the prince became the first shadow of conflict between the spiritual and political worlds that had long coexisted in balance. For a time, his actions remained within the boundaries of dissent. Then, ambition crossed into aggression. Ancient accounts tell of attempts to discredit or even harm the Buddha, incidents shaped by legend but grounded in a real struggle of principle. Stones were said to have been hurled from cliffs, elephants driven into frenzy and sent charging through the streets. Each attempt failed, less through miracle than through the remarkable restraint of the man they targeted. The Buddha's composure in the face of hostility revealed the depth of his understanding, that anger answered by anger only multiplies suffering, and that hatred left unanswered eventually exhausts itself. The dispute exposed a deeper truth about the order. The Sangha was not immune to the human weaknesses it sought to transcend. Jealousy, pride, and rivalry entered even among those who had renounced the world. Yet these same tensions forced the community to clarify its foundation. The Buddha insisted that the Sangha remain governed not by personality but by discipline, that its cohesion depend on conduct, not charisma. Leadership was a matter of example, not inheritance. Devadatta's faction eventually dissolved. The strict asceticism he demanded proved unsustainable, and his allies drifted back to the main body of the order. The controversy left scars, but also strength. The Buddha used the episode to illustrate the danger of ambition cloaked in righteousness. The path, he reminded his followers, lay in moderation, even in virtue. The refusal to turn conviction into control. The wider world observed these events closely. The Sangha had become too large and visible to escape the scrutiny of courts and scholars. Many rulers, having once welcomed the new doctrine, now weighed its growing influence with caution. Yet the Buddha neither defended nor justified himself. He continued to travel, to teach, and to accept the impermanence of all institutions, even his own. What had begun as a conflict within a family had become a lesson in the limits of authority. In later years, Devadatta faded from prominence. Some traditions describe his repentance, others record only his decline. History remembers him less as a villain than as a mirror of the passions the Buddha sought to transcend. His challenge marked the moment when the Sangha ceased to be a fragile fellowship and became a durable order, tested from within as well as from without. The Buddha's response to betrayal, calm, deliberate, and without malice, revealed the maturity of his teaching more clearly than any sermon. He understood that even the struggle against falsehood must be free of hatred. For hatred, once awakened, binds teacher and opponent alike to the same delusion. Compassion was not weakness. It was the only force capable of ending conflict without perpetuating it. As the years passed, the Sangha regained its harmony. The monks and nuns returned to their long cycles of wandering and retreat, their lives measured by the rhythm of the seasons. The episode of Devadatta entered memory as both warning and proof that even within a community devoted to liberation, the mind's old habits remain. The thirst for recognition, the will to dominate, the fear of loss. Yet through the discipline of awareness, these forces could be seen and understood, and in understanding, dissolved. The Buddha continued his travels across the Gangetic plain. The roads were familiar now, the same paths he had walked as a prince, as a beggar, and as a teacher. Along them, the Sangha moved like a living river, carrying the teaching through the heart of India. The challenge of Devadatta, once threatening, had become part of the Dharma itself, another lesson in impermanence, another reminder that even discord can serve the path of understanding. In this way, what had begun as a test of loyalty became a demonstration of resilience. The order survived not through suppression, but through clarity, not through force, but through patience. By meeting opposition with composure, the Buddha ensured that the Sangha would endure long after both master and rival were gone, sustained by the same quiet strength that had carried him beneath the Bodhi tree. The Buddha's reputation had grown beyond the Sangha. From the Himalayan foothills to the coastal plains, rulers and peasants alike spoke his name. Yet he remained what he had always been, a wanderer. He travelled lightly, resting in groves or village outskirts, accompanied by a small group of monks. His path followed no map. He went where questions waited to be answered. Each season, his journeys traced a pattern across the heart of India. He moved through the kingdom of Kosala, the territories of Magadha and Videha, and the open republics along the northern frontier. Kings sought his counsel on matters of governance. Hermits sought debate. The poor sought comfort. His presence transformed these encounters. He spoke without ceremony, addressing each person according to understanding, not rank. In his view, the distinction between ruler and subject, scholar and laborer, mattered less than the shared condition of human frailty. In the city of Shravast, the capital of Kosala, his meetings with King Pasenadi revealed the depth of his political wisdom. The monarch, burdened by war and the weight of courtly intrigues, found in the Buddha's reasoning a new measure of strength. They met not as prophet and disciple, but as two men confronting the realities of power. The Buddha urged reflection rather than conquest, the governance of self before the governance of others. Pasenadi listened, not because the words were novel, but because they were practical. His court, accustomed to flattery and divination, found in this ascetic a mind that judged action by consequence, not by favor. At other times, the Buddha's wanderings brought him into contact with people far removed from thrones or councils. He met laborers resting by the roadside, herdsmen tending cattle, craftsmen in workshops filled with dust. His speech remained the same, clear, direct, and grounded in the experience of suffering and change. He did not ask for allegiance, but for awareness. To each listener, he returned the same truth, that freedom was not a gift granted by gods or kings, but the result of understanding one's own mind. Among the many who heard him was a figure whose story would endure through centuries. Angulimala, a man feared across the plains for his violence. In youth, he had been a scholar, later turned murderer, living as an outcast in the forests. When he crossed paths with the Buddha, legend tells that the meeting ended not in confrontation, but in transformation. Whether the details are literal or symbolic, the tale reflects a recurring pattern in his ministry: the ability to turn even the most hardened spirit toward reflection rather than destruction. For the Buddha, redemption was not a matter of miracle, but of recognition. To see clearly, even for a moment, was to begin to change. He spoke as readily with skeptics as with believers. The Brahmins who challenged him often found their own doctrines reflected back through questions sharper than argument. The Buddha dismissed the obsession with birth and lineage that defined their order, insisting that character, not heritage, measured virtue. In an age when caste governed every aspect of life, this assertion was revolutionary. The worth of a person, he taught, lay in action, in the capacity to refrain from harm, to speak truth, to act without greed. Merchants and craftsmen found in these principles a moral foundation that required no priest to interpret. The Eightfold Path: right view, intention, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration, provided a code for daily conduct rather than ritual performance. Its simplicity appealed to the growing urban classes who sought an ethical life amid commerce and change. The Sangha's presence in these communities strengthened bonds of trust and generosity. Donations supported the monks. Guidance and stability flowed in return. The Buddha's encounters with women also reflected his broad compassion. In a society that confined them largely to domestic life, his openness to their capacity for wisdom was exceptional. Many lay followers were women of influence, patrons who supported monasteries and sponsored gatherings. Through them, the teaching reached households that had once been closed to public discourse. His tone toward them was never paternal, but respectful, recognizing in their experience the same potential for understanding that existed in all beings. The impact of these years extended beyond the spiritual sphere. The Buddha's insistence on restraint and compassion altered the political climate of the age. Some rulers adopted policies of moderation, easing taxes, curbing violence, and supporting charitable works. Others saw in his example a model for personal discipline. The idea that a leader's power was measured by self-control rather than conquest began to take root. Through all these encounters, the Buddha retained a detachment that preserved the purity of his purpose. He neither sought favor nor rejected it. When kings offered gifts, he accepted only what was necessary for the community. When scholars praised him, he turned the praise aside, reminding them that understanding was the product of effort, not adoration. His authority lay in consistency. The same calm that had endured the storms of Devadatta's envy now carried him through the attention of the world. As age advanced, his face grew thinner, his step slower, but his voice retained its quiet strength. Those who had known him in youth saw the same composure, untouched by time. To walk with him along the dusty roads was to sense the balance he embodied, a human being fully awake to both the impermanence and the beauty of existence. The record of his life during these years is filled with movement, councils under trees, gatherings by riverbanks, long hours of walking beneath the sun. Each meeting, whether with a king in his hall or a beggar by the roadside, followed the same pattern. He listened, reflected, and spoke not to persuade, but to illuminate. The truth, he said through action, rather than words, could be recognized in the way a person lived. By the time the Sangha reached its maturity, the Buddha had become more than a teacher. He was a moral presence woven into the daily life of an entire region. His influence flowed through kingdoms and villages alike, dissolving boundaries of class and belief. Those who came to him found neither promise of heaven nor threat of punishment, only the invitation to see the world as it was and to act within it with wisdom. In this long season of travel and encounter, the journey that had begun with solitude beneath the Bodhi tree had become a dialogue with humanity itself. The Buddha's path moved through the hearts of rulers and commoners, through the restlessness of the world he had once renounced. Everywhere he went, he left behind not converts, but examples, lives altered by the discovery that peace was not the absence of suffering, but the clear comprehension of it. Through his steps, the quiet revolution of the mind continued to spread across the plain, shaping the conscience of an age and setting a pattern that would outlast its kingdoms. Years had passed since the night Siddhartha Gautama left the palace gates behind. The Sangha had grown from a handful of disciples to a movement that stretched across the Gangetic plain. Kings had become patrons, merchants benefactors, and scholars pupils. Yet among those who knew him only by name, there remained one place where his absence still lingered as wound and memory: the city of his birth. In Kapilavastu, King Shuddhodana ruled into old age. The palace that had once shimmered with music and anticipation had grown quiet. Courtiers spoke of his restraint, of how he no longer attended festivals or appeared at public ceremonies. The birth of his grandson, Rahula, had not erased the sorrow left by his son's departure. Word of the Buddha's fame reached him from travelers and merchants, carried like rumor across the plains. At first he dismissed these stories as exaggeration. In time, he realized they could no longer be ignored. The ascetic spoken of by kings and peasants alike was indeed his son. The decision to summon him came not from pride, but from longing. Messengers were sent to the Sangha, inviting the Buddha to return home. The journey would take him across the same roads he had once traveled as a fugitive from privilege, now retracing them as a teacher known throughout the region. The news spread quickly through Kapilavastu. The Shakyas prepared the city for his arrival, unsure how to greet a prince who had renounced everything, yet commanded greater reverence than any ruler. When he entered the gates of his birthplace, the streets were silent. The people watched from windows and rooftops as the monks walked barefoot through the dust. The sight was unfamiliar and humbling. Gone were the silks and ornaments of royalty. In their place was the simplicity of the robe and the bowl. The Buddha's composure carried no trace of triumph or remorse. For him, the return was not an act of reconciliation, but of completion, a circle closing quietly upon itself. In the palace courtyard, Shuddhodana awaited him. The years had bent the once proud king. His hair had whitened, his step had slowed. Yet when father and son faced each other, ceremony dissolved. The distance of time and grief fell away in the stillness between them. The Buddha bowed, not as subject to sovereign, but as son to parent. For a long moment, neither spoke. The old king, whose dreams of empire had faded into age, saw before him the fulfillment of another kind of destiny. The prince who had left to seek the cause of suffering had returned, having ended it within himself. The city celebrated his presence. The nobles of the Shakya clan came to listen to his teaching, joined by merchants, servants, and soldiers. The walls that had once divided rank and lineage seemed, for a moment, to loosen. Among those who came forward to meet him was Yasodhara, who had lived all these years in quiet dignity. She had raised their son, Rahula, in the knowledge of his father's search and its purpose. Their meeting was restrained, but full of understanding. Nothing needed to be said. Each recognized in the other the trace of what had been lost and the peace that had taken its place. Rahula, now a boy, approached the father he had never known. The accounts describe him standing before the Buddha with the straightforward curiosity of youth. He saw not a ruler or a stranger, but a figure of calm authority. In the days that followed, he stayed near his father, asking questions, listening to the monks recite their verses. When the Buddha departed again from Kapilavastu, Rahula chose to follow. His ordination into the Sangha became both a symbol and a continuation of his father's path, the transformation of royal lineage into spiritual inheritance. Shuddhodana's final years were marked by serenity. Freed from the hope that his son would return to rule, he found contentment in the understanding that Siddhartha's renunciation had brought peace not only to himself, but to many. When the old king died, it was said that the Buddha remained by his side, guiding him with the same composure he had once shown to strangers along the road. The reconciliation between father and son was complete, not through words of forgiveness, but through the acceptance of impermanence that both had come to understand. For the Sangha, the visit to Kapilavastu carried lasting consequence. It demonstrated that the renunciant's life need not sever all human connection. The Buddha's compassion extended equally to family and to strangers. His discipline did not require withdrawal from affection, but freedom from possession. The return to his homeland embodied the very balance he had taught, the ability to live among the attachments of the world without being bound by them. After the ceremonies and farewells, the Buddha resumed his wanderings. The road once more became his home, the open sky his shelter. Behind him, Kapilavastu returned to its rhythms, but the city would never again be what it had been. The prince who had renounced its wealth had transformed it through absence and through return. The example of his life stood as a mirror to all who sought permanence in power or comfort. In later generations, the memory of his homecoming would be retold not as a story of repentance, but as a lesson in continuity. The Buddha's journey had begun in the sheltered courts of Kapilavastu, moved through the extremes of asceticism, and culminated in insight beneath the Bodhi tree. His return completed the circle, demonstrating that enlightenment did not separate a man from the world, but reconciled him with it. The Sangha continued its travels across the plains, carrying the teaching to new cities and kingdoms. The story of the prince who had become a teacher followed them wherever they went, a reminder that the search for truth begins within the ordinary patterns of human life. In Kapilavastu, the memory of his visit endured. The sound of his voice in the palace courtyard, the sight of monks walking barefoot through the streets, symbols of a transformation that had begun within one man and spread quietly through the world he had left behind. By the middle years of his teaching, the Buddha's community had become a reflection of the society from which it had emerged and a challenge to it at once. The Sangha stretched across the plains, a network of monastic settlements linked by paths of pilgrimage and memory. Merchants, farmers, nobles, and servants provided food and shelter to the monks during their rounds. The teaching had spread far beyond Kapilavastu and Magadha. Its influence reached into courts and markets alike. Yet one question remained unresolved within the order itself: the place of women in the pursuit of liberation. From the beginning, women had followed the Buddha's path as lay disciples. They offered alms, listened to teachings, and practiced meditation in their homes. Many were patrons whose generosity sustained the early monasteries, but the rules of the Sangha, shaped by custom and caution, admitted only men to full ordination. It was an omission born not of doctrine, but of the social conventions of the age. The idea that women could live the same renunciant life as men was almost unthinkable in the rigid hierarchies of northern India. That barrier began to erode through the persistence of one figure, Mahāparinibbāna, Gautama, the Buddha's aunt and foster mother. She had raised him after Queen Maya's death and had watched from a distance as the prince became the teacher of an age. In her later years, she approached him with a request unprecedented in the history of the Sangha, that women be permitted to leave household life, to live in simplicity, and to seek awakening as nuns. At first, the order hesitated. The Sangha's structure had grown carefully, with rules designed to preserve its discipline amid the instability of public life. The inclusion of women, bound by different expectations and vulnerabilities, seemed to threaten that balance. Yet Mahāparinibbāna's resolve did not waver. She and a group of women from the Shakya clan shaved their heads, donned simple robes, and walked to where the Buddha was teaching, demonstrating by action what they asked to be allowed by rule. Their determination forced reflection. The Buddha understood that the truth he had discovered beneath the Bodhi tree was not confined by gender. The causes of suffering and the means of liberation were the same for all beings. To deny women access to the discipline that ended ignorance would contradict the very principle of compassion on which the order rested. In time, the Sangha accepted their admission. The Bhikkhunacha order, the community of nuns, was founded. The decision marked a turning point in both religious and social history. For the first time, women in India could pursue a spiritual vocation independent of family or caste. Their monasteries arose beside those of the monks, governed by their own codes and councils. Many of the early nuns were women of exceptional intellect and strength, poets, scholars, and teachers who contributed to the preservation of the doctrine. Their verses, collected later in the Theravada, reveal voices of profound insight and unadorned humanity. In them, the experience of enlightenment appears not as an abstraction, but as a reality lived and embodied. The new order faced resistance. Some among the monks feared that the inclusion of women would weaken the discipline or invite scandal. The Buddha's solution was pragmatic. He established additional rules to preserve mutual respect and separation of authority, ensuring that the community's integrity rested on conduct, not convention. The Sangha thus evolved from a fraternity of wanderers into a dual order, bound by shared understanding but distinct in organization. The acceptance of women did more than expand membership. It redefined the reach of compassion. The doctrine now spoke directly to half the population that society had kept silent. Laywomen found in the example of the nuns a model of moral independence. The relationship between householders and the monastic community deepened. The Sangha ceased to be merely a circle of philosophers and became a social force, influencing family life, education, and ethics across the plains. In the cities, wealthy patrons built residences for the nuns alongside those for the monks. In villages, small hermitages appeared where women could live and practice in safety. The sound of recitation filled these new sanctuaries, voices repeating the same teachings that once had been spoken beneath trees and in open courtyards. The expansion of the order changed not only who could follow the path, but how the Dharma itself was preserved. The participation of women ensured that the teachings survived not through isolated authority, but through communal memory shared between the sexes. As the Sangha entered its maturity, it became a mirror of the world it sought to transform. Farmers and kings, men and women, ascetics and householders, all found in it a structure through which to order their lives. The simplicity of its discipline stood in quiet contrast to the complexity of the surrounding civilizations. Its monks and nuns moved like steady currents through a restless world, teaching that equality lay not in social status, but in the universal potential for wisdom. In the years that followed, the Buddha continued to oversee the growing institution with the same detachment that had characterized his search. He reminded his followers that the Sangha was not an end in itself, but a vessel for the Dharma. The robes and rules, the councils and monasteries, were means of preserving a way of seeing, not monuments to his person. The community's strength depended on humility, not hierarchy. Through the founding of the Bhikkhun or order, the Buddha's vision reached its full human dimension. The path of liberation had opened to all, limited only by effort and understanding. In that inclusiveness lay the proof of the doctrine's universality. What had begun as the journey of a single man beneath a tree had become a society guided by conscience rather than birth, a community where enlightenment was no longer the privilege of a few, but the potential of all. From that moment onward, the Sangha stood not only as a refuge for those who renounced the world, but as a living example of the world transformed. Time had passed, and the Buddha's years of wandering drew toward their close. The Sangha was vast now, its presence woven into the fabric of daily life across northern India. Monasteries had risen where once there were only forest clearings. The teaching had spread from royal courts to remote villages. Yet the man at the center of this transformation remained faithful to the life he had chosen, that of a simple wanderer. He was approaching 80 years of age. His body had grown thin, his step slow, but his mind retained the luminous steadiness that had carried him since Uruvela. Those who walked with him during these last travels saw both the frailty of age and the calm that accompanied it. He accepted illness as he accepted all conditions, as facts of the world, neither to be resisted nor invited. The final journey began in Magadha and led northward through the familiar towns of the Ganges plain. The Buddha stopped in each to meet those who had followed his teaching for decades. Kings and ministers received him with ceremony. Farmers and craftsmen greeted him with reverence. The order he had founded now guided thousands, yet he reminded his disciples that the Dharma was not his possession. What endured would not be the man, but the understanding he had awakened in others. The route led eventually toward the borders of the Malla Republic. The season was hot and the roads dusty. Near the town of Pava, a smith named Kunda invited the Buddha and his monks to eat. The meal was simple, prepared with devotion, but it marked the beginning of his last illness. Fever and exhaustion weakened him as they moved on toward Kusinara, a small settlement surrounded by groves of sal trees. There, realizing that his body could go no further, he asked to rest. A bed of leaves was spread between twin trees, whose branches were heavy with blossoms. The air hung still, except for the distant murmur of the river. The monks gathered around him, aware that their teacher's life was nearing its end. His composure did not change. He lay on his right side, one hand supporting his head, his expression tranquil. The serenity that had defined his teaching was now visible in the simplest gesture, the quiet acceptance of dissolution. Those who were present later spoke of a profound silence that settled over the grove. It was not the silence of grief, but of recognition, that the event before them was not tragedy, but completion. The Buddha's life had always been a demonstration of impermanence. His death would be no different. He told his followers that decay is inherent in all things, that the Dharma and the discipline were to be their refuge. Nothing more was needed. As the light faded, the sal trees shed their white petals, scattering them over the ground like a final offering. Witnesses remembered the stillness of that moment, the absence of struggle. For the man who had taught release from attachment, there could be no clinging, even to life itself. What ended beneath those trees was not an empire or a faith, but a human journey, from ignorance to understanding, from seeking to seeing. When the night deepened, the breathing grew slower, then ceased. The monks bowed their heads. The forest seemed to breathe with them, as though the very landscape understood what had passed. In that quiet clearing at Kusinara, the search that had begun 3 generations earlier in the palaces of Kapilavastu reached its end. The days that followed were filled with both grief and composure. The monks built a pyre of fragrant wood and prepared the body according to the customs of the time. The cremation was not an act of mourning, but of reverence, a recognition that even the vessel of enlightenment obeyed the law of change. The ashes were collected and divided among 8 kingdoms, each building a stupa to enshrine its portion. From these monuments would arise the earliest centers of Buddhist devotion, spreading the memory of the Buddha across the subcontinent. The Sangha, though shaken, did not dissolve. Under the guidance of senior monks, it gathered soon after the passing at the city of Rajagra. There, in what would later be remembered as the First Council, the disciples recited the teachings and the rules of discipline from memory, ensuring that the Dharma would survive unbroken. The assembly's purpose was not to canonize the Buddha as a god, but to preserve his words as a manual for human freedom. News of his death traveled swiftly. In every region where the ochre-robed monks had walked, people paused to reflect on the fragility of existence. The Buddha had lived long enough for his humanity to be undeniable. His passing made his message universal. The truth he taught required no faith in miracle, only the courage to face impermanence. The image of the dying teacher beneath the twin trees became one of the great symbols of world history. A life completed in full awareness, a mind unmoved even as the body returned to dust. His disciples called this final state Mahāparinibbāna, the complete release from the cycle of birth and death. For them, it was not extinction, but fulfillment, the end of ignorance, the completion of wisdom, the peace that comes when all striving ceases. In the forests around Kusinara, the seasons turned. The sal trees bloomed and shed their petals again. The river continued its slow passage to the sea. Travelers who came upon the site spoke of its quietness, a stillness unlike any other place. There, the life of Siddhartha Gautama had dissolved into the landscape of the world that had shaped him. The same world he had taught his followers to see with eyes unclouded by fear, His journey had begun in privilege, passed through deprivation, and ended in understanding. The Buddha's death, like his awakening, belonged not to myth but to the pattern of things, the endless arising and passing through which all existence flows. In accepting that pattern completely, he had found the freedom that eludes kings and beggars alike. The path he revealed remained a simple truth carried in memory and practice, that peace is found not in possession or belief, but in the clarity with which one meets the changing world. The morning after the Buddha's passing, the sal grove at Kusinara was heavy with the scent of ash and flowers. The fire had burned through the night, and only embers remained where his body had rested. The monks stood in silence, the sound of the river steady behind them. Grief passed among them, not as wailing, but as stillness, a recognition that what had ended could not be held. The master had departed, yet his presence seemed to fill the clearing more completely than before. When the embers cooled, the relics were gathered. According to the customs of the time, they were divided among 8 kingdoms: the Malla, the Lichavi, the Sakya, the Bulis, the Mauryas, the Koliyas, the 2 great powers of Magadha and Kosala, each claiming a share as tribute and remembrance. Stone urns carried the ashes and fragments of bone to their respective capitals, where earthen mounds were raised and sealed above them. These stupas, at first simple domes of clay, became the earliest monuments of Buddhism. Pilgrims came to them not to worship a god, but to honor a man who had shown that mortality itself could be understood without fear. The division of the relics was an act of devotion, but also of political symbolism. Each kingdom, by housing a portion, aligned itself with the moral prestige that the Buddha's teaching had come to embody. The sight of these monuments scattered across the plains gave the doctrine a geography of its own, a network of sacred points linking diverse peoples in a common memory. From them, the later architecture of faith would grow. The carved stone railings of Barhut, the great hemispheres of Sanchi, the spires of Sri Lanka and Burma centuries later. The Sangha, still raw from loss, turned its energy toward preservation. At Rajagra, in the shelter of a mountain cave, the senior monks assembled to recite everything that memory could hold. Ananda, who had served as attendant and heard more of the Buddha's words than any other, recounted the discourses. Upali, guardian of the monastic discipline, recited the rules governing the order. The gathering became known as the First Council. No written record existed. The entire teaching was preserved by repetition, rhythm, and community memory. The spoken cadence carried the doctrine through generations, transforming understanding into sound. From these recitations, 2 streams of continuity began to flow. The first was the Dharma, the body of teaching that defined the nature of suffering and the path to its end. The second was the Vinaya, the code of conduct that ensured the Sangha's survival as an ethical institution. Together, they formed the living framework of Buddhism, a religion without priesthood or revelation, sustained by memory and practice. In the years that followed, the Sangha dispersed once more across the plains. The monks who had gathered at Rajagra returned to their roots, carrying the discipline to new settlements. The patronage of kings and merchants continued, giving the order stability. Communities of lay followers maintained the monasteries and preserved the stories of the Buddha's life. Within a few generations, those stories had taken on the resonance of myth, but their foundation remained historical. A human being who had seen through ignorance and revealed the means of liberation. The relics, now enshrined across India, became the axis of pilgrimage. Travelers from distant provinces traced routes between them, exchanging ideas, stories, and local interpretations of the doctrine. This movement of people and thought turned Buddhism from a regional fellowship into a civilization of the mind. From the Gangetic Plain, it spread south to Sri Lanka, east to Burma and Thailand, north through the passes into Nepal, Tibet, and Central Asia. Wherever it took root, it adapted to language and culture. Yet the core insight endured: impermanence, causation, compassion. Over time, the teachings diversified. Some communities emphasized the original discipline of the early Sangha, focusing on personal liberation through meditation and ethical restraint. Others expanded the doctrine into vast cosmologies, reimagining the Buddha as a universal principle of awakening. Yet even in these later transformations, the trace of the historical teacher remained, a man who had looked directly at suffering and found in its comprehension the possibility of peace. Centuries later, the great king Ashoka would rediscover the relics and raise stupas across his empire, sending emissaries to lands far beyond India's borders. Through his patronage, the Dharma became both moral code and state philosophy, uniting territories not by conquest, but by the ideal of compassion. The empire of understanding that the Buddha had never sought now extended across oceans. But in the beginning, in those years, immediately following the death at Kusinara, there was only the quiet persistence of memory. Monks walking the roads with bowls in hand, chanting the verses that preserved the essence of his vision. The order survived not through power or miracle, but through discipline and remembrance. Each recitation, each act of restraint became a living continuation of the night beneath the Bodhi tree. The story that began with a prince in the valley of the Ganges closed with a teaching carried by countless ordinary lives. The Buddha's relics turned to dust, his words to sound, his presence to example. Yet the path he revealed remained, a way of seeing that transformed the fleeting into the eternal by accepting change itself as the nature of existence. In the centuries to come, kingdoms would vanish, languages would change, and monuments would crumble. Still, the figure of the Buddha would endure, not as deity or ruler, but as a reminder of what the human mind can discover when it turns inward with honesty and compassion. The mortal life of Siddhartha Gautama had ended, yet the awakening he unveiled continued to move quietly through the world, as constant as breath and as boundless as time itself.